Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Scares That Shaped Us, a podcast about horror writers and the stories that made them. I'm your host, Matthew Jackson, and we have made it to episode 20. That means that I have to keep doing this podcast forever now. If I had stopped before 20, we would have been able to just hang it up and be okay with that. But now, 20 episodes, y'all are stuck with me. Friday, February 28th, was also the 6-month anniversary of this show, which completely flew by me because I got this kid and he turned 2. So we were a little busy. Having said that, if you're listening to us for the first time, or if you've been listening to us since episode 1, thank you so much for tuning in, being a part of this, sharing the show on social media, rating us, reviewing us, doing whatever you do to support this little side gig I have of talking to some of my favorite people about some of my favorite stuff. Y'all rule. And I'm going to say thank you with a banger of an episode this week. Cynthia Pelayo is here. We are going to talk to her about her new novel, Vanishing Daughters. And we're going to dive into one of those stories that was always going to be a part of this show sooner or later. Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? By Joyce Carol Oates. I'm really glad that Cynthia picked it. It's a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. In the meantime, I just want to mention real quick, in terms of recommendations, Oscar night was a couple nights ago as I'm recording this, and The Substance won an Oscar for Best Makeup and Hairstyling. It was also up for a few more. I know Demi Moore was kind of the favorite for Best Actress. She did not get it. Mikey Madison got it. I love Mikey Madison. I love Honora. I still want to encourage horror fans to go watch The Substance. I know that everyone's been telling you to watch The Substance for like half a year at this point. But the reason we keep telling you to watch The Substance is because The Substance rips. It's amazing. Demi Moore is amazing in it. Margaret Qualley is amazing in it. Dennis Quaid is amazing. Coralie Fargett did an amazing job writing, directing, designing this movie. It looks amazing, sounds amazing, will absolutely freak you out in all the best ways. It's streaming on Mubi. You can sign up for Mubi with a free trial. I think they're not paying me to say that, but I'm pretty sure you can. And they got great stuff over there at Mubi. So if you sign up for The Substance, look around. You're going to find some other stuff that you like, that you want to watch. Trust me. My only other recommendation this week is Ghoulish Book Festival. It's coming up on March 14th and 15th in San Antonio, Texas. I'm going to be there doing a couple of things, including at least one panel that I might live to regret, but that's what I get for being friends with Max Booth. So if you want to see me make a fool of myself, you want to buy some cool books from some cool small presses, you want to hang out with cool horror people, badges are $50. Go to ghoulish.rip and you will get all the details you need. So if you're in Texas and you don't have anything going on March 14th and 15th, you want to come to a cool horror fan fest, check out Ghoulish Book Fest. I would love to see you there. And hey, if you're listening to this and you are going to be at Ghoulish Book Festival, come find me, say hi. I'll be the guy who looks like me and also has a badge around my neck with my name on it. So look out for that. Anyway, everybody, that does it for me rambling this week. Let's head over to our interview with the great Cynthia Pelayo. This week on The Scares That Shaped Us is one of horror's brightest stars. She is the Bram Stoker Award-winning author of Into the Forest and All the Way Through, Children of Chicago, The Shoemaker's Magician, Forgotten Sisters, and this year's Vanishing Daughters. Cynthia Pelayo, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks for being here. I want to start by talking about Vanishing Daughters. I love this book. This is a beautiful, devastating, haunting book, and I'm excited for more people to read it. For those who maybe haven't been keeping up with upcoming releases, could you give our listeners a little taste of what Vanishing Daughters is?
Sure. Vanishing Daughters follows Briar Rose Thorne, who has recently inherited her family or her ancestral home in the south side of Chicago. It is a crumbling mansion because throughout time, the family has just had financial struggle. Their business went under. And Briar's mother, who she was very close with, died. And so Briar is struggling with intense grief that is resulting in strange manifestations and physiological issues. And she's also a journalist, a health journalist, and she should be writing because she's a freelancer and she has to fix this leaking, crumbling home. But she starts getting interested in a series of murders, of unsolved murders of women on the south side of Chicago. And slowly she starts piecing together that there is a potential serial killer operating, and she gets a little too close, and the serial killer sets their eyes on her.
There's so many ways into this book. It is so wonderfully gothic. It has the true crime angle. It has Chicago history. It has fairy tales. It has dream imagery. What was your way in? Like, how did you even begin to conceive this really multidimensional thing that you've created?
This is you. So if you've read my books, people know what my books tend to be like, and I think they're becoming more. They're almost like a Rubik's cube. You just have to keep like twisting it, and I don't. While I appreciate paint by numbers novels. And I'm saying that not as an insult at all, because I do really think I enjoy those works where we kind of go in and we're just going to the end. I like things that are constantly like unraveling like a ball of yarn, because then that's what keeps me interested. And so the way I write is I write multi-themed stories where I don't write character-driven plots where you're just following one character from like one point to the end of the, I don't know, desert or something. I write theme-driven novels where the theme here, there's multiple themes. There's the theme of grief. There's the theme of the vanishing hitchhiker. There is the theme of a real potential serial killer operating in the city of Chicago. And then there's also the theme of Chicago as a place, as a sentient place. And so there's also several themes about history of violence, how, especially with the immigrants that built the Illinois Michigan Canal, that I talked about, the Irish immigrants, and how like they just died and people don't even remember them. So there's multiple themes in my books, and fairy tales, of course.
You mentioned a serial killer aspect of this book, and I'm sure this is something we'll talk about more as we head into the story you chose. I know that you are a true crime obsessive, and I know that you talk about true crime a lot. You've done Instagram lives about true crime and haunted Chicago and all of those things. You're obviously like steeped in this history. How do you balance that deep knowledge and deep dives into this subject matter with inventing something new? Do you find yourself leaning too hard on historical details? Like, how do you approach balancing research with creating?
See, I love the research and I can get lost in the research. I've been known to write too many pages that are just like going off in like a historical tangent. I think we had to pull like 30 pages out of Forgotten Sisters because they're like, this is great, but this is like now a thesis paper. You got to pull that out. It's a huge balance, especially with I don't want my books to sound too nonfiction-y, because if I go there too much, then my readers get mad. But it's really important for me to highlight, hey, there really is this, like in Forgotten Sisters, it's about it's also, besides all the other themes of history, violence, immigrants, it also deals with this growing issue of young men being found drowned in the Chicago River in our waterways. Like it's dozens over the last few years, and people just keep saying it's an accident. And I'm like, that's not an accident. Something's happening. And here with Vanishing Daughters, I'm covering a very true crime issue where it's 51 women, mostly of color, have been found in the south side of Chicago. Similar circumstances. They've been asphyxiated, they've been strangled, burned, set on fire, and dumped in garbage cans. Like nearly all of them. And then the law enforcement, it's like, yeah, there's nothing similar about these murders at all. And so I try to weave those things in as best as I can with the narrative. I feel like I've gotten better without being without having too much blocks of nonfiction about true crime at a time. So I'm learning as I feel like as a writer, if you're not always working on your craft and adjusting things and learning and growing, for me, I feel like I'm doing a disservice to myself. And so I feel like I've gotten better at weaving that in.
This brings me to a question I really like asking writers, which is it's sort of built on the axiom that you don't learn to write, you just learn to write the book you're writing. So what you talked about growing and changing and learning as a writer. What do you feel Vanishing Daughters taught you about your own creative process and yourself that you're now going to carry with you going forward?
That's a great question, because I feel like I'm definitely pushing myself as an author to do new and different and experimental things. Because if I'm not interested in it, then I'm not going to want to write it. But I think Vanishing Daughters taught me a little bit more how to ground myself a little bit more with writing a fever dream, because it is a fever dream. And I hope that people kind of know a little bit more positionally where they're at in space and time. That's really difficult to do in text with creating. And I do that. I like my novel. I say my novels, my recent novels have like this Alice in Wonderland effect. That's what I'm trying to do. And a lot of readers don't like that. They get mad. So my books are probably not for those people, and that's fine. But when you're going into one of my books, I want you to kind of feel like physiologically, like I don't know where I'm at. What day is it? What time? Like, I want to create that experience. And I feel like if you can create that experience in a reader, that's amazing.
This is interesting that you mentioned this, because we're talking a few weeks after the passing of David Lynch, and you said something interesting on Blue Sky that I wanted to ask you about, and this brings it up. You mentioned the importance of surrealism in your writing and your imagery, and it's interesting you talk about Vanishing Daughters as a fever dream, and it does like I never felt lost in the sense that I knew that you knew where we were going, so I felt good. Like, I felt like I was in the hands of a confident storyteller. But there is the way that Briar perceives the world because of her circumstances. There are all of these notes of surrealism in the way that she perceives things. Is that something that just comes instinctually in your work, or is it something that you have to consciously build in?
It's instinctually there, surrealism. And I had early on, super early on in my writing, when I started being a fiction writer, because I pivoted from journalism, very like structural, the leads at the top, so it was very structured type of writing. And when I got to see, before the major newspapers all folded across the country, I got to, work in some old school newsrooms and work with some old school, reporters and editors who were still like smoking cigars and drinking whiskey and like their cubicles, and they would mark up my paper. So I learned so much from these people. But then when I went into my MFA to learn to write fiction, it would just show up, the surreal. And I didn't want to write realism at that time, because I left journalism because of PTSD, because of covering so much crime. And so I would go in and I would start writing just what I would think was a realism story. And then the ghosts would appear and all these strange things would happen. And my advisors were like, "You're a horror writer who doesn't know she's a horror writer." And so I just leaned into it. But I feel like I'm leaning into it more now. And I feel, while there's apprehension, because I know surrealism is something where a lot of readers or just consumers don't really understand, it's where I'm most comfortable with, and it's where I'm more excited to push my work into.
This is also a craft question that I like getting nerdy about, but I was able to talk to Kaylee Peterson about this when she was on the show. In addition to all of your journalism background and the prose that you write, you're also a poet.
Yes.
And a very acclaimed poet and a very good poet. I as someone who cannot write poetry, as a journalist who writes prose but has never been able to crack the poetry thing, I am fascinated by poet brain versus prose brain. So how does that work for you in your mind? How do you know when an idea is working its way out as a poem versus a piece of prose?
Before I had to fight it. So before I would have to sit and say, okay, this is going to be a poem and that's all it's going to function as. And then I would have to fight it and say, I'm writing a novel about two sisters in a haunted house. But I am grateful for my current editor, or all my editors right now, that they have pushed me and said, go and push the poetry into the prose. It's fine. And I've gotten so excited. I'm like, really? I can do that? And they're like, go for it. And so I've been pushing more of my poetry into the prose. I think my biggest issue is I echo a lot in my sentences. So they'll be like the same word will be repeated in like several sentences. And so I'll have to like clean that up in edits because they're like, it just doesn't translate as a reader reading prose, if people understand what I mean. But I'm trying to weave in, I guess long-winded, I'm trying to weave in my poetry more into my prose. But I love poetry. If I could just write poetry all day long, I would.
So let's move over to our chosen story, if you don't mind, because this is one of those stories that when I started this podcast, someone's going to pick this. It's going to happen eventually. I'm very curious who it's going to be, and I think you're the perfect writer. And if I could like pick from the current horror scene who to talk about the story with, it would probably be you. So we're going to talk about Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been by Joyce Carol Oates, originally published in 1966, anthologized, one of the most anthologized stories of the 20th century. If you haven't read it, we are going to like talk about the whole thing. The story's almost 60 years old. So, get on that. If you're looking for an easy place to find it, listeners, Joyce Carol Oates has a collection called High Lonesome, which is a sort of a career retrospective. And your library probably has it in ebook as well as a physical copy. So go find it if you haven't read it. Cynthia, it's such an amazing story. What is your experience with it and what made you bring it to the show?
I don't even remember when I read it first. And I would think that would be like a pretty pivotal moment, but it feels like it's just been this story that's always been there with me. And it's haunting. It is dreamlike, and it is one of the most terrifying stories I've ever read. And it was in reading this story that I knew I could pull off Into the Forest and All the Way Through. So Into the Forest and All the Way Through was a poetry collection I wrote about 100 missing and murdered women. And I wanted to approach it, my poetry collection, I wanted to approach it from mostly the perspective of the victim and what it's like to be like involved in this type of crime. And when I read Joyce Carol Oates' story, I knew I could pull it off without romanticizing true crime. And I feel like that's definitely, and it's here. Like you have true crime true crime board games and true crime cruises and true crime. I mean, the podcasts and the documentaries are everywhere. And I started thinking about it from like a family perspective. Like if I was, God forbid, the mother of a daughter that was a victim of a crime like this, how would I feel like if my daughter was the topic of a board game? And so it was absolutely horrific. And Joyce Carol Oates was influenced by a serial killer in writing this story, Charles Schmid. I believe he killed several young women in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And so there are a lot of elements in the story that echo his crime. And what's interesting about the story, like you can interpret the story all day long. And I just quick overview, it follows a young girl named Connie. She's beautiful, blonde hair, It's summer. She's gorgeous. She's in her teens. She's going out to with her friends to movies and to have food, and she's beautiful and she knows it. And she has another sister who isn't as traditionally or isn't doesn't look like her. And Connie and her mother are at conflict. Connie believes that her and her mother are at conflict because Connie is so beautiful. And a lot of the story is about that Connie being young and beautiful and carefree. And it definitely has this like whimsical element. And one day she's out and she encounters a boy, who she thinks is a boy, and tells her, I believe, I'm going to get you, baby. And it's a boy, a young man next to a car. And that kind of sets the course of the rest of the story. I think before we dig into it much more, it also feels like a fairy tale. It could feel like, of course, it could feel like an adaptation of Little Red Riding Hood. I've heard it called like a reverse fairy tale. And we could talk about that, see how spoilery we want to get. But it's terrifying. It is the way that she ratchets up the tension. It's like several pages of tension towards the end. It just scares the hell out of me, even reading it recently to talk about it right now.
Yeah, I read it last night, like right before bed, which was probably a mistake. And I know that this is one of those stories, by the way, just a tangent for our listeners, that it's one of those things where people are like, well, is it horror or is it psychological drama or whatever? I know it rides the line and we talk about horror stories here, but as Cynthia just said, and as I'm telling you now, like it is a scary story. No matter, and you can come at it from so many different angles. For me, I don't remember when I first read it either, and I think it's one of those stories that's just in the air. It's like Repent Harlequin Said the TikTok Man, or The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. It's just all over. If you did any kind of English lit reading in high school or college, it's gonna come up. The thing that I remember initially when I kind of went back to it, I remember being so scared by it. And then I go back and look at it from more of a craft level. And I realized the thing that got me about it was when this happens to Connie. So she goes out with her friends and she sees this guy. And then later in the story, the guy who said, I'm going to get you, comes to her house while she's alone at her house. And as he talks to her, he's at first sort of just sounding like a very brash young man who wants to take a girl out. And she's kind of flirting with him, kind of like, I don't even know who you are. You leave me alone, whatever. And then he starts to slowly let in little details of like, he calls her by her name and she says, how do you know my name? And he's like, oh, I know a lot about you. And the more the story goes on, the more you realize that he knows her name. He knows who her family is. He knows that her family is not home. He knows that they will not be home for a long time. He has, one way or another, planned this out so that she is completely alone. And I've talked about this on the show before. I grew up on a cattle ranch in Central Texas where my immediate family were the only people around me. So if I was home alone, I was truly home alone. And the idea of a car pulling up with someone getting out and saying like, I know you're alone and I know you're going to be alone for a long time, freaks me out. I want to talk a little, you mentioned Charles Schmid. There's also a really interesting, Joyce Carol Oates dedicated this story to Bob Dylan. And she has called his song, It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, one of the sort of tonal inspirations for this. And if you listen to that song, it is very much a, hey, whatever you had, you got to pack it in because we're done. And one of the most overt, well, I'm very curious to hear what you mean by reverse fairy tale, because the interpretation that I latch onto the most is probably the simplest one, which is just like she's encountering the devil or death, like
Yeah.
this. And so I just have to now. I have to ask because I'm so curious. Like, what is the reverse fairy tale interpretation? Because I don't feel like I'm latching onto that very well.
So you mentioned the devil. Let me grab the devil and then the reverse fairy tale. So yes,
Okay, yeah.
there is a lot of reference. Go ahead. You can like interpret this forever, and for like a true crime person, like this is like the perfect story just to kind of like look into. And so there have been references that this could be interpreted as the devil because she is told, she's tempted, she's lured to come out of the house. He doesn't go in there. And so there's been discussions, literary discussions, that it's reflective of Jesus being tempted by the devil. And so she's being tempted to come out. So that's been one discussion. There's like a lot of different literary discussions. In terms of like the reverse fairy tale, or like our traditional, even though it's not traditional, because so many Grimm's fairy tales are really gruesome and awful things happen to the women in the stories, but it's also because of that, because she I guess we'll just spoil it. She leaves the house. He tells her, "You're going to come here to me. I'm not going to go in there. You're going to come to us." And so there isn't it's not redemptive. The princess at the end literally walks into the hands of the villain.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. Okay. Yeah, this is the other truly terrifying thing about the story is his name is Arnold Friend, which is its own freaky kind of, it conjures certain images. And especially when you hear a guy's name is Arnold Friend and then Oates talks about him grinning at her, and I'm like, I don't want to see that guy's grin. But he tells her, you're going to come for a ride with me. And she says, no, I'm not. And he says, no, you are. You're going to come for a ride with me. That's what's going to happen. You're going to be my lover. He starts using that language and uses very sexually dominant language with her eventually. And she constantly refuses. She says, I'm not coming in the house. And he tells her, this is the part that stuck with me this time, that for some reason didn't last time I read this. He tells her, I'm not going to come in the house. I promise you I'm not going to come in the house because you're going to come out of the house. And then she says, I'm going to call the police. And he says, if you call the police, if you touch that phone, I will break my promise.
Yeah.
But then it gets weirder because she does touch the phone, but he still never comes in the house. But she touches the phone and picks it up. And this is the sort of Lynchian surrealism of it to me is Oates describes the phone. She puts the phone to her ear and she hears a strange roaring sound coming through the phone. And she doesn't really know what to do. And she just starts freaking out and screaming. And it's moments like that add to another one of the common interpretations, because there's a scene there's an interstitial scene where she's sitting on a lawn chair in the backyard and she closes her eyes. And when she opens her eyes again, she looks back at the house and it seems very far away to her. And because of those sort of notes, people interpret it as it's a dream, like it's a nightmare. She saw this creepy guy at the drive-through restaurant. He said something to her, and now she's dreaming about him coming to her house, which I always think it's a dream is the least interesting version of these things. But that's also because of the language she uses, it's an interesting one.
No, I agree. There are a lot of places in the story throughout that where she'll say it felt like I believe she's like, it felt like the window, but it wasn't the window, or it's never been my window before, or she says things like that. And when she wakes up, like she knew she was hardly there, and it's almost like herself, like she enters almost like these between spaces, and it's almost, I don't know if it's, you can interpret it as her intuition is on high alert, or you can interpret it as just a structural thing within the story that this is it. We are now entering the terror, or we're now now the monster is about to enter scene. With I Every time I go and reread this story and I tell someone I'm going to reread the story, I get like another piece of interesting information. Someone said, and if you remove the R's in Arnold Friend's name, it spells an old fiend. And we haven't talked about like his appearance. We kind of touched upon it, but so she thinks he's a young boy, or her age, because she's 15. So she thinks it's another, young teenager. But there's parts throughout where he's standing outside the car and he's talking to her. And she even mentions it looks like his hair is wild. And then she mentions, he puts his sunglasses on his head, almost as if he is wearing a wig.
Mm-hmm.
And then she starts noticing the lines on his face as he smiles. And he looks like he's a 30-year-old man. And she asks him, how old are you? And he becomes offended. And then he does have a friend or a partner in the vehicle with him. And at that point, she also notices, oh, that's not a boy either. He looks like a man baby, or the way she referred to him. So these are two older men that are in this car. Then the car itself is very strange because the car is painted, and we could talk a little bit about that. And there are like images painted on the car. It's like gold. There's numbers painted on the car that people have done all sorts of things with the numbers. They have added them up. They have looked up Bible verses. They have, I believe Schmidt was 33. One of the numbers on the vehicle was 33. Some people said these could be the number of victims, the ages of his victims. You can go on and on.
My favorite Arnold Friend detail, and this is a new one that I picked up this time, is she notices all those things about him. She also notices something weird is happening with his foot. He has this moment where his foot is at an odd angle and she can't figure out how a foot could do that. And then she realizes that his shoe is moving independently of his leg. And she starts to think, oh, he must be one of those guys who stuffs newspaper in his shoes so he can wear bigger shoes, and maybe it makes him look taller or something like that. But it could also be interpreted as maybe he doesn't have human feet. Maybe he's the devil at the dance who everyone looks down and he has a tail and cloven hooves.
Schmidt would stuff his shoes.
Yeah.
And that's what I've heard. So Schmidt, the serial killer, would stuff his shoes, and then other people have interpreted as it is the devil, and he's got hooked feet.
That's amazing. I didn't know the bit about Schmidt stuffing his shoes. That's incredible. But yeah, I'm glad you brought up his friend Ellie, who this brings up another. There's so many layers in this story. It's great. It brings up another layer because Connie when we meet her in her like vibrant teenage life, she's doing all the classic 60s teenager things. She thinks her older sister is the favorite. She doesn't like her mom. She thinks her mom doesn't like her. She goes out with her friends, but she not only is going out with her friends, she's sort of lying to her mom about what she's doing when she's out with her friends. And she talks about her relationship to pop music and how she enjoys how freeing and life affirming the pop music that she's listening to on these outings is to her. And then when these guys pull up, she has the radio on in the house, and she goes out to the porch and she sees Ellie, the other guy, sitting in the passenger seat of this car with a radio, a portable radio just up to his ear. And he's got it on the same radio station. So there's this weird echoey thing where the radio is coming from both sides, and he almost never speaks. He's just sitting there listening to the radio. And the creepiest thing about him is when he does speak, I think his only line in the story is when Arnold is. Yeah. Because Arnold is talking to him about the phone, and he just goes, "You want me to pull that phone out?" He's the friend who is like, "I will go cut the phone line for you if you want to just take this girl right now." Oh.
Yeah. Did you notice too? I noticed it this reading too, that So yes, music is huge. It's so popular to her. She's talking about music, and then the first half of the story, when she leaves her outing with some friends and some boys, and then the friend's dad picks them up from the mall, she says, and then the music stops. So the music, after there was music in the beginning half when she was out being a kid having fun, and then it stopped when she was picked up to go home, and the music didn't turn back on until this awful second half, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, there's just so much. And we haven't talked about the car. You alluded to the car.
Yeah.
The car is amazing. Picturing this car, like there are people who make short films out of this story and things. I can't imagine the car ever looking in an actual image as weird as it looks in my mind, because she describes it as painted gold.
Mm-hmm.
And she describes it as a jalopy, which suggests that it's just kind of a beat up car that this guy has sort of souped up himself. But he has all this. He has his name painted on it, and then a weird smiley face next to his name. He has like the one of the rear fenders or something is dented, and he wrote "done by a crazy woman driver" on it. And then there are the numbers, and it's not. He calls attention to the numbers, which is such a. I've never heard Oates discuss this story in any like great depth. I know she's written on it, and she talks a little bit about what she thinks the story means in some of her writing, but the numbers are amazing because he points to them and he says, "This is kind of a secret code I have." And the numbers I think are 33, 17, 13. I think those are the numbers. And that, 33, 19, 17. Yes. So like you said, there are people who are like, oh, it's a reference to the book of Job. That's what this is. It's Job. I like to think that it does a thing, and we talk about this on the show all the time. So listeners, I'm sorry if I keep bringing it up, but one of my favorite things in horror is this notion of secret knowledge, this notion that the author knows what this means, but we don't necessarily know what it means. Do you feel that? Do you feel like Oates knew what she was doing, or was she just was this just a character moment for him to make himself even stranger and more mysterious to Connie?
Oh, I think she knows so much about this story.
Yeah.
I've heard her talk about it, but very generally. I've only ever heard her talk about like specific questions about. I've heard her asked about Bob Dylan, dedicating it to him, and she had said about the Bob Dylan dedication that that song just felt like a fairy tale and it felt like it fit. But then she said she hadn't followed his career after that. But I love when authors do this, and I'm all for doing this. Like, you have these hints to yourself and you just let the readers just go nuts and trying to interpret it until the end. And I never want her to say what it means. I just want us to keep interpreting it. I mean, I look at these numbers and I'm like, well, those could be, like I said, ages of victims. Those could be his age. That could be the first 33 could be his age, followed by his first two victims. And then it says, in the text, he's like, and he raised his eyebrows at her to see what she thought of that, because it seems like he knew, obviously our own friend knows what those numbers mean, the character as well. And so he wanted to see if she had caught on. But throughout the story, as we continue on through the story, he tells her what he's going to do to her.
Yes.
Is very clear. And, it's not just one line, but, for, trigger warning to the audiences. But he is telling her she is going to be taken and she is going to be raped and killed. That is what he is telling her very clearly in this story. And she just she knows that what he's saying is terrifying. She tells him to shut up. She's scared. And so that's why it's so interesting that she walks out of this house. It's awful.
Yeah, I mean, it. I believe she originally titled the story "Death and the Maiden," and I think maybe that was too on the nose, and it got changed. But it does have that feeling, whether you take it as allegory or as like a real story of a teenage girl who sort of doesn't see another way out of her situation.
Mm-hmm.
It does feel like the story of a young woman, like in the flower of youth, just absolutely with everything ahead of her, turning and facing death and not really being sure what's about to happen, but knowing that promises have been made. It's devastating, and it's devastating even in the context of, like, Joyce Carol Oates writes about true crime a lot, whether she's referencing things that happened, or she's done Black Dahlia stories. She did a whole book based on the Ted Kennedy scandal, where a woman died in his car after it went over a bridge. She definitely is known for mining these things and turning them into fiction. This is the one that sticks out. And in a career, I mean, she wrote a whole novel about Jeffrey Dahmer, basically.
Gosh, it's terrifying. Have you read it? Zombie?
Zombie is, I mean, she won the Stoker Award for Zombie. And listeners, if you haven't read Zombie, Zombie is one of the more unsettling things you can read in popular fiction, I would say.
I could not. So I couldn't finish it, but I got to half, and that was what I used to get, because I was looking for influence for the serial killer for Vanishing Daughters. And I started reading Zombies, and I was like, I can't anymore. Joyce Carol Oates. It is so unsettling, and it's so effective what she does in that novel, that I was so unsettled, I had to donate it and get it out of my house.
Yeah, I don't own it. I wonder if I would feel. It's been so long. It's probably been 20 years since I read Zombie, but she is known for looking at true crime through a fictional lens. Yeah. And even with Zombie in mind, like, this is the Joyce Carol Oates story. Like, if you've only read one Joyce Carol Oates story, it is this one. And that's in a career that is, she's been writing for 70 years and is astonishingly prolific. Like, I went and looked up Joyce Carol Oates on my ebook app at my library last night, and there were like 10 novels that I didn't even know existed that she had published in the last like 15 years. She's insane. Why do you think this one? Why is this a story that 59 years later we are still not only reading it, but realizing that it is so rich with meaning?
Two things. Of course, I think I'll start with the writing. So structurally, it's beautiful, the writing, and it's very haunting. And the mood is definitely effective throughout, and just the pacing of this all. In terms of the actual story, I think what is so striking about it is that she takes such a normal thing, a young person, and shows how within moments something completely horrible can happen. And that's the case even today. When you think of so many people that have gone missing, that have been murdered, sometimes it just takes a few seconds for someone's life to completely get turned upside down, or to be targeted, or to be picked up at a grocery store parking lot and thrown into somebody's car. It's horrible to say, but these things happen. And I think that we see how someone's life, that we see that before. Someone's just a normal day, going out with their friends, their parents, the next day their parents leave. So many of us have been home alone as teenagers. And like you said, could you imagine somebody outside your door saying, you're going to come with me and you're not going to return? And it's all, and he tells her it's all over for you. Come out. You don't want, I think, there's also the threat. He threatens her family, like, you don't want your people in trouble, do you? So that could be like another reason why she probably left, but who knows? But I think it's because of that, because we saw how quickly something so normal can turn into something so horrific.
It's really, it's interesting that we're talking about this. And if I veer into territory that's uncomfortable for you, because I know you talked about your PTSD, just tell me and we can change the subject. You were a journalist. I worked for a daily newspaper in East Texas for several years and was the crime reporter, and was fortunate enough to not, it was a small city. We didn't have a lot of major crime. I worked there for 5 years. I think I covered 2 murders, and one of them could have been a version of this story. It was a teenage girl home alone, and a guy that, as far as I recall, she had like met him briefly at Walmart or something. And a guy came into her house while she was alone and stabbed her to death, and didn't ever really, there wasn't necessarily any evidence of serial murder in his history. There wasn't a lot of information with regard to motive. And because she was alone, there was no like piecing together like a complete timeline of why and how. But it is one of those things. If you cover it and you like, actually, like, I went to this girl's funeral. Wow. Because I had to for work, and it was such a if you and you know this, and I hope listeners never have to know this, but like the suddenness and the inexplicable nature of it, the closer you get to it, and I'm fortunate enough that I don't have thank God, murder victims in my family anywhere, but the closer you get to it, the more you are aware of how quickly it can happen, and how it is a giant boulder being thrown into a pond, and the ripple effects are immediate and powerful, and they will stop you dead in your tracks. And this story does such a great job of, like you said, it spools out this tension of like, why is he here? Is he just here to bother me? Is he? And then it drops, and you're just suddenly like, oh no, he's dangerous. And he's not just dangerous, but he's like, he planned this. He is malicious. So yeah, it's it's not a happy thing to talk about, but it is an extremely impactful piece of fiction.
Right. And we see we get glimpses of his psychology within this. And that's also part of it too. Like, it's not just an internal story from her perspective, because it's third person. And so we get to like get so much about him and his character and his mannerisms. And we get to see, like you said, he manipulated the situation. He's been planning this. This has been methodical. He knows her name. He knows her friends. He knows where she lives. He knows where she was going to be. That is terrifying. And so anyone who's ever been stalked, that is absolutely like, terrifying to know. And just, there is no question. It's like that this is a ghost, at least, on the surface, this is a human being doing this. And I know some people, like you said earlier when we started, some people would argue, is this a horror story? Is it not? It is a horror story because people kill people. Yeah.
Yes. You mentioned reading, partially reading Zombie, in developing your villain for Vanishing Daughters. What other, because I know you're passionate about when it comes to depicting things based on true crime or true crime, that you want to depict victims as whole people, but you also need to come up with an interesting killer. What were the other sort of sources of inspiration that you were turning to in developing that?
This one was a hard serial killer to come up with, and he took me a long time, and I was very mad at him because of that. And so it was a lot of reading accounts or YouTube videos or news clips of serial killers being interviewed, because I wanted, and I also went back and reread Silence of the Lambs as well, and I was like, this isn't that, but there is like this calmness about the serial killer that I wanted to develop, because I wanted somebody that was not over the top, and I wanted somebody that was just so cool and calm, almost like Arnold Friend here. It's like really just cool and calm, but cruel at the same time. And the voice was difficult to pick up until I started reading Zombie. I was like, okay, I don't want to hear this voice anymore. And then I slowly was able to, the voice from my serial killer just turned on, and I wanted to get him out of my head as soon as possible, because my serial killer, like Arnold Friend, targets and assaults women, and I just needed this thing out of my head and to put it down and be done with that book.
We've talked about fairy tale imagery in It's All Over Now, Baby Blue, and we've talked about it in relation to Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? This novel, Vanishing Daughters, is obviously drawing a lot of influence from fairy tales, and Sleeping Beauty in particular. And I know it's something that you're also very, very passionate about, or you wouldn't have put it into this book. So was Sleeping Beauty always or fairy tales in general, always kind of a framework thing that you were thinking about for this novel, or did it just sort of happen organically because you know that story so well?
Sleeping Beauty just happened really organically for this one. I generally have a framework of a fairy story or a fable or something in mind. This one fit because there's so many different variations of Sleeping Beauty. Many of them deal with a beautiful young woman that is cursed by something, and then that beautiful young woman is also like taken advantage of by a man at some point, and then she loses her agency at some point. And so I wanted that type of framework, and I referenced several versions of Sleeping Beauty throughout the novel. There's like sections of the original pieces of Sleeping Beauty. But what a lot of people don't realize is that in one of the versions of Sleeping Beauty, she saves herself. She just wakes up from her curse, and she isn't saved by a prince. And so I wanted to have my princess save herself from this awful, awful, awful curse, even though she kind of had another woman help her, I guess, in a way.
Yeah, it's I don't want to give anything away. Well, I'll ask this: was her name always Briar, or did that come when you realized Sleeping Beauty was the thing here?
That took so long too. I think she probably had 5 or 6 names before, and that was really hard because I can't really get into the novel until I have their name. Like, and I'll pace for like days and take notes and just start losing my mind because I'm like, I need to write this book, and if you don't tell me your name, I can't write your book. And it was in reading the variations of Sleeping Beauty that I just started laughing to myself, and I was like, it's going to be so on the nose, but I'm going to go with it. You're Briar, because it's one of Sleeping Beauty's names in one of the fairy tales. And I was like, and it just kept feeling right as I was writing it. I was like, okay, fine, we're gonna go for it. So,
can you tell us anything about what you're working on now, and where you're headed right now creatively before we let you go?
I am working on another fairy tale that's due like ASAP. I have tons of like short stories and essays and things that will be out soon. The Children of Chicago, the Chicago saga, Children of Chicago, The Shoemaker's Magician, and La Turia are all being re-released this year, and so those will all be available finally widely in all Barnes and Nobles and your local bookstore. So I'm really looking forward to those being back.
We might have to have you back to talk about those, because I've not read those, so I will have to go back and enjoy.
Thank you.
Enjoy those books. Cynthia, before we let you go, I know Vanishing Daughters is out March 11th. I know you have stuff coming up to promote it. Where can people find you online to keep up with what you have going on?
My website, cynthiapelayo.com, CINAPELAYO.com. I'll have all my events listed on there. I'm on social media. I'm on Blue Sky and Substack. Those are like the main places I'm at. But go to my website. That will be the most up to date.
Our guest has been Cynthia Pelayo. Everyone go buy Vanishing Daughters. It's great. Cynthia, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much. Nice meeting you.
Thanks once again to Cynthia Pelayo for being on the show. It was wonderful to get to know her a little bit, chat with her about her work and Joyce Carol Oates and fairy tales and true crime and a lot of other stuff. Vanishing Daughters is in bookstores everywhere March 11th. So go pick it up, pre-order it if you haven't pre-ordered it. Go get it in the store. You will not regret it. It's a beautiful, beautiful novel. And go find Cynthia on socials. She has been a wonderful presence in my feeds on Twitter and on Blue Sky for a long time. She's very encouraging, very honest, very open, and generous with her time. She's done some pitch events on Blue Sky that were wonderful for up-and-coming writers. She's just cool as hell. So go follow her, keep track of everything she's got going on. If you want to keep track of everything we have going on, you can follow us on socials. The best way to do that is to go over to Blue Sky and follow us at Scares Shaped Us. That's where most of our posting happens at this point. We also still have a Twitter account, but it's mostly just posting new episodes. That is also at Scares Shaped Us. We are the Scares That Shaped Us on Facebook, and we are the Scares That Shaped Us on YouTube. If you prefer to listen to your podcasts on YouTube, go find us over there, like, subscribe, get those episodes. We also have a website, thescaresthatshapedus.com. That is where you can find an archive of every episode we've done so far. When I remember to update the site, which I'm very bad at, but I will do my best to get the new episodes up there as they come out. You can also find contact info for us up there, as well as links to all of our socials. I will also just tell you our email address is scaresthatshapedus@gmail.com. If you want to email me a suggestion, a question, something you'd like to hear us talk about on the show, an author you would like for us to feature, always happy to read your emails. And I should say, disclaimer, just because you email me and tell me to put someone on the show doesn't mean it's going to happen right away. We have a backlog of guests. It's a high-class problem to have. I am getting to everyone as I can, and I appreciate everyone's suggestions. I appreciate all of the authors who have reached out to me about possibly being on the show. We're going to keep going. Like I said, 20 episodes. We got to keep this thing going now. So if you're in line to be on the Scares That Shaped Us, stay in line. That's it for us this week. Next week, we will be back with a brand new episode featuring the one, the only friend of the show, Stephen Graham Jones. He returns to talk about his new novel, The Buffalo Hunter Hunter, and to talk about Catherine Bigelow's Western vampire masterpiece, Near Dark. That's the first episode that I've ever recorded actually sitting across from the guest. That means it might sound a little weird, but that also means I had a lot of fun just hanging out with Stephen. Look for that March 12th at noon Central. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. I'm Matthew Jackson, and you've been listening to The Scares That Shaped